So I understand that back in the now apparently you can't really talk to members of the other party, but I understand you actually had a roommate of the other party. Did you?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
You remember your good friend Eugenia Chapman, one of your good colleagues.
Wonderful person.
Well, we became friends. From my very first term down there, we decided to share an apartment. So for 6 terms, I've shared an apartment with Jeannie Chapman, the Democrat. We co-sponsored a lot of bills. And we founded the Conference of Women Legislators, you know, as a team, which gave us a little power. But I have to tell you, when I came back after the first week or 2 down there and told my husband now, look, it's expensive to have hotel rooms. I think I would like to get a roommate and share an apartment. And he said, it's okay to share an apartment with a female Democrat, but not a male Republican.
Well, I'm glad to know that he kept the lines clear.
That's right, he kept it clear. And it was fun. Eugenia and I had a system. Of course, when there were party line votes, like between management and labor, workmen's compensation laws, there were things like that, where we differed on principles. But when most of our bills were about education or health or things that affected women and children. And so if I had a bill coming up, I'd tell Eugenia before the session, and she'd run up and down the aisle pushing people's buttons and getting people, you got to vote for this, it's Giddy's bill. And I would do the same thing with Eugenia, you know, you've got to vote for Eugenia's bill. Now I understand from Judy Biggert and other representatives that are there, my friends, Republican friends, that if you even talk to somebody on the other side of the aisle, the leadership thinks maybe you're a spy, or you know that you're going to cross over and vote the wrong way, and there's just very severe party discipline. They couldn't conceive of rooming with somebody of the opposite.
Yeah, I really think that's unfortunate, and I think it's true at the national level too. There was much more collegiality. This indicates that it isn't just because we had cumulative voting that we had the collegiality, but the parties have been allowed to become much more galvanized about basically non-coalition issues. I mean, there are issues on which you can coalesce both within the party and between parties, and there are other issues where you just plant your flag and say, here I am, and if you're not with me, then you're disloyal.
That's right.
And unfortunately, both parties have reflected these non-coalescing kinds of issues, both nationally and locally. And again, the presence of cumulative voting made that harder to do, because you always had mavericks within both parties that would cross over and feel comfortable doing it on the issues. Right. And you had within each district, you would have someone who represented the conservative Republicans, who had strong views on some of the social issues, and you could represent the more moderate Republicans who thought that maybe a woman's place was maybe even in the Senate as well as in the House.
That's right, that's right. You mention these hardcore issues like abortion and gun control and school prayer. I mean, things where there's a very, very, very deeply felt opinions on both sides.
And about which there's no room for negotiation, no room for compromise, but mostly there's no room for orderly discourse. And this is what I have been fooling around with this abortion issue, right to life issue, freedom of choice issue ever since I was back in the legislature. Giddy, I don't think I've ever persuaded one person to my point of view who had the other point of view. It's just one of those issues that people say, this is where I am and this is where I'm going to stay.
That's right.
And so it's not the kind of issue that lends itself to legislative compromise.
That's right, because it comes down perhaps to a religious feeling, a moral conscience, and you cannot argue with people's conscience. They feel that way.
And again, there are always going to be some issues like that. We had gun control and capital punishment when I was down there, but those weren't the only issues that the legislature would concern itself with, and those weren't the only issues that defined the parties. And now, unfortunately, we're allowing that to become kind of litmus tests.
That's right.
What makes a Democrat or what makes a Republican.
That's right.
I'd like you both to maybe talk to each other about how constituent service was handled with cumulative voting. Having 3 people and, you know, maybe shifting a request over to somebody else, or just what the dynamics were.
Well, again, I recall that when it came to what we used to call casework or constituent representation or the ombudsman part of our job, that because there were 3 of us, we were able to allocate the burdens. If it was something that involved one of the patronage agencies, I would say, well, go see Nate Kennelly, he
Right.
deals with
He'd
that.
take care of that.
And if it was something involving a uniquely Republican concern or issue, Noble League could handle that, and I could do the other things. We didn't have much staff. I don't know if they got any better after I left or not, but that made it a little harder than now. But on the other hand, as you pointed out earlier, Giddy, there's a price that the people pay when the staffs are larger and
That's right.
are ending up too much into the decisional process.
That's right, when the members have to serve on more committees and can
Right.
possibly handle it all themselves. Yes, in our day, we all answered our own mail. I mean, you had a steno pool up on the fifth floor, remember?
Right.
And so I don't think one person, one representative could have possibly handled all that. Now you had it divided between 3 people. And as in your district, if it were a conservative person, they would automatically call Ray Hudson rather than calling me. And then my constituency would call me, and then the Democrats would call Glenn Schneider. And everybody had someone they trusted and felt shared their point of view and would help to solve their problem if this was possible.
And the interesting thing is, and I've thought about this many times, is that within a district, if there was something that was really of local concern,
Yeah.
a particular school or a particular public institution of some kind, because you had a representative of each of the parties in there, you could get that point of view expressed in both party caucuses and in both parties, so that if the Woodlawn Hospital wanted something as a public institution in the district, not only could I and Representative Kennelly bespeak it within the Democratic Party caucus, Noble League could bespeak it within the Republican Party caucus, so that in a sense, it really gave the local legitimate parochial concerns better presence and better voice than they have now.
I think that's very true. I think that's sort of a fundamental point to consider.
Do you recall anything where, in your district, the 3 of you would unite around a local issue on the western suburbs? School, a particular issue that the 3 of you would say, let's get this done for our district and work together?
Yes, I think occasionally there would be an issue that would unite us, as a local, non-controversial, maybe a freedom that the county board may have wanted, or that a village may have wanted for its park department or whatever. Yes, we'd all go to bat for that.
I remember one that involved a concern that we had about the transportation system on the south side. The Illinois Central Railroad, as I recall, had some particular, I think it was the beginning of their fiscal troubles, which finally led to their being wrapped up in Metro. But there was a particular piece of legislation that both Noble Lee and Nate Kennelly and I and the State Senator all coalesced on to make sure that it would benefit the people who had to use public transportation in the district. So there were issues like that. And again, it's harder to do when you're a single-member district, simply because no matter how strong the individual representative is, they're only representative of that one party. And,
That's right.
And in party councils, we don't normally invite Republicans to come address the Democratic Party caucus.
That's right.
This is my last one. I was astounded when you said the Republican was the dean of a law school, and the
Yes.
thought that a dean of a law school could get elected now to the General Assembly seems outrageous. Could you talk about that? The caliber of some of these
Yeah, that was one of
people.
the caliber of the legislators and so on.
Yes.
Well, I don't want to cast invidious comparisons between the caliber of the legislators now and the caliber of the ones that when Giddy and I were there, but it is true that the legislature, I think, had a wider appeal to people when we were there. It appealed to younger people who were just starting their careers. It appealed to professionals, partly because it was more part-time and you could pursue your profession as
That's
easily as you
right.
could. And partly because, again, it didn't require the kind of expenditure of campaign funds. I mean, the main reason I think people are chilled about running for the legislature these days is that assuming everything else were in place, the amount of money you'd have to spend just to get nominated and elected in the first place.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's a crucial point. When you had a smaller district, it was split up 3 ways, it was a good starting point for a career in politics. I mean, look at how many people who were in the legislature, like yourself, went on to higher callings and became judges.
Higher, or different colors.
Different.
Well, my first campaign for the legislature cost $3,000. And this was in a contested primary
Oh.
against the party organization, and the total cost was $3,000. It was a lot of money then, but at least it was manageable. When I hear of them spending hundreds of thousands of dollars
Oh,
to
yes.
elect a individual representative at this point, it boggles the mind.
Yeah.
I can't imagine myself undertaking the task today with that kind of.
No, I would never have run if I had to raise that amount of money. I think our area was a little more expensive. I think I spent $5,000 on that first campaign.
But you lived in a ritzy district.
No, I think Hyde Park outranks us by some. But it was a hard fought.
I'm sorry. Do you think having cumulative voting would make it less expensive to get nominated or elected?
Oh, absolutely, especially if you had the three members in a district, three representatives in a district. If you're going to go for bigger districts, then people will have to spend more money.
Right.
Wouldn't you agree?
But if you kept the same size districts that we have now and had 3 members in each, it would be less expensive than the contested races are now. First of all, particularly in getting nominated in a primary, you can appeal to a much smaller set of voters.
That's right.
Which involves a much smaller amount of money being spent on advertising, on media, and so on. And I have no doubt that if we could restore cumulative voting, there would be a lot more interest on the part of young people and newcomers in running in the first place. And that would be very healthy.
And people with a variety of backgrounds.
Exactly.
I mean, you wouldn't have to be a wealthy lawyer, you should pardon the expression.
Well, it's unfortunately true that there are it's too hard if you're not a wealthy lawyer to even think about running
That's
for the
right.
legislature. I can't, you mentioned before, I don't know that a law school dean could consider running for today's legislature, spending the amount of money and time that he or she would have to spend to get elected.
Yeah, I would doubt it. I would doubt if they could run, and I would doubt if they could serve.
Yes.
Well, this has been wonderful.
Right. Anything else? That's what we do.
Yeah.
Final thing, anything that
You
you
can
want
ask
to
each
say
other.
that we haven't said or just
No,
fill
but
out?
anytime Giddy wants to run again, I'll vote for him.
Oh, I'd be your campaign manager. I want to see you on the Supreme Court.
I want to stay where I am.
Good, all right. That's
Wonderful.
So, if you could say your name and what title you would like us to put underneath your name.
All right. I think we can be honorable for the rest of our lives.
right.
So,
He's the only one here.
Right.
I want to talk to him.
want me to look at him?
Never at the camera.
Yeah, okay. Just Giddy Dyer, because that's where I was really known when I campaigned. Honorable Giddy Dyer.
And then underneath, do you want us to say former state representative?
Yeah, a retired, former state representative.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah,
From Hinsdale?
yes.
Okay. Let's see. Could you tell us how you decided to get your start in politics?
Oh, all right. It's a long story, so you're going to want to cut it a little bit. But I was always active in League of Women Voters.
The question in the answer. The answer.
Oh, right.
Oh, yeah.
So if you could repeat.
Repeat the question.
Yes.
Okay. How did I get started in politics, or why? All right. I had always been active in the League of Women Voters, and then I was president of a local league in 1956, and felt, here I am on the sidelines, and all the action is out there on the field. I want to get in the action, because I was strongly for Dwight Eisenhower. So the next year, I joined a group called Republican Workshops, and which taught us, what the precinct committeeman does and how parties really work, and became a precinct committeeman. And one thing led to another. There was a scandal on the county board, so a committee came to me and asked me to run for the county board, because I had never run for office before, and they said they wanted a blue ribbon citizens group to run, and we did. And so I served 8 years on the county board, and then when my local representative retired, left an empty seat, so then I ran for the legislature. And the first primary was very, very tough, very hard fought. But I managed to squeak through that, and then after that it was smooth sailing all the way.
On that first primary,
Was cumulative voting a key factor?
Right, yeah.
Just, go, sorry.
Yeah, I'll feed it back.
on that first primary, did you tell your supporters to bullet for you? And what role did cumulative voting play?
Oh, yes. I would never have gotten elected. You're asking me, did cumulative voting play a part in that election? Absolutely, because my county chairman was from the other branch, the right-wing branch of the Republican Party. And I would never have been, quote, asked to run by that county chairman. So I had to, when I decided to run, I really had to form my own campaign committee and the whole organization and not depend on the party for any help. And we were able to do that. I was able to build a team of volunteers and we were able to do it. So I'm very grateful to cumulative voting for making it possible for somebody who doesn't happen to agree with their particular county chairman to make a point. And Gene Hoffman in the neighboring district was the same situation. He was a school teacher and very strong on education and from the moderate wing of the party, and he had to build his own organization to run. So I think just an average person who's used to private life would really not dare to run in today's world unless they were invited to run, you know, by the county chairman. And they'd really have to have the county chairman's support.
How could you build such an organization without any big sums of money?
Well, it's funny. There was not one paid person in my whole campaign, with the exception of a student at the University of Illinois who wrote my press releases. And I paid him a small sum, something like $100 a month. Everybody else was a volunteer. And we just caught fire. They were attracted to the issues that I was supporting. And we were able to build a whole army of volunteers. In fact, at that time there was a little branch of the Tribune called the Little Trib, which covered DuPage County. And quite frequently our team, the Dyer organization, would back somebody for, say, sheriff or some other office that was not backed by the county chairman. And one headline came out in the Little Trib when our candidate won against the organized party's candidate: "The Dyer Mafia has struck again." And so we were called the Dyer Mafia, this bunch of, you know, middle-aged suburban women and men. We always got a kick out of that.
Did you tell your supporters to bullet for you in the primary?
Oh, absolutely. I could not have won without the bullet vote, because they were protesting, really, the policies that had been set up by the county chairman and his philosophy of government. So bullet voting is extremely important for an independent candidate coming in. I'm sure Abner Mikvar would say the same thing. I'm sure he had to have the bullet votes.
What role did having the bullet vote play in inspiring people to join your campaign?
Well, I do think it got them excited, because they could go around door to door and say, just vote for Giddy Dyer in this representative spot, you know, just vote for that one. It gave them a crusading kind of zeal in the thing.
So you're saying that, could you tell me how cumulative voting in the primary not only helped independent Democrats in the city, but independents perhaps all over the state?
Well, their situation would be similar to mine if they were, whether they're an independent Republican or an independent Democrat. If you want to be a candidate and you do not have the blessing of your county chairman, a very powerful figure in either party, then you're in the position of having to build your own team, and you just need that bullet vote in order to be successful.
Wonderful. Could you tell me a bit about how cumulative voting affected the election of women?
Oh, that is a good question. I'm glad you asked that. How did it affect the election of women? Up until the time that I ran, there were very few women in the legislature. When I went in, it was sworn in '68, there were only 4 of us total of 4 of us in both houses. So people had not, obviously used accumulative voting to get women elected. But I think that was the society's view of women rather than anything to do with the cumulative voting or not cumulative voting at that time. But as the women's movement became more and more active in the 70s, then people used this tool that they had, didn't realize they'd had it. In 1972, through the efforts of Hope McCormick, 6 new Republican women were elected, which automatically then doubled the size of women in the House from 4 to 8. It's been very exciting to see. I think women need cumulative voting more than men do to get elected to the legislature.
Keep this right here. Let's see, what was, now I'm blanking out. You have a question?
Let's go to the usual one, is how, it's kind of out of order what he's doing, but were you there after the change? You personally, were you, you changed?
No, I retired. I could have gone another time, but I retired in January '81. You see, just as the change came.
Oh, that's a good idea. Let's talk about how the House is now, in your opinion, and from what you've been able to, from your friends that serve in Springfield, what's been the effect of single-member districts?
Okay, what did my friends in Springfield tell me about the mood in the legislature now? Well, I have several very good friends, Judy Biggert for one, who are still down there, and Gene Hoffman, who is a lobbyist now and goes down every week, and also Glenn Schneider. And here I get it from both the Democrat view and the Republican view, that they all say, Giddy, you would hate it down there because the leaders call you into caucus and they say, this is the way we're going to vote on each one of the bills. In my day, there would be an occasional party position on a really crucial bill where there was a very clear difference between the two parties, and we would caucus. That would happen maybe once or possibly twice in a whole session. But now they say it happens every week, you know, and they're giving their marching orders for that week. And another thing that has come about since the change, I do not know whether you can blame the absence of cumulative voting for this, but I think it's part of it. The leaders themselves collect a lot of the campaign money. For instance, the big PACs, the big corporative PACs and the labor union PACs and so on. Instead of giving money to individual candidates, give to the leaders of both parties in both houses. So you can imagine the power this gives them. They can pick who they want to give the money to, and then each of the people that they've given a lot of money to run feel beholden to them and do not dare defy the party leaders. So this is a terrible thing. I think cumulative voting would help to cure that because it would give each person has more independence to begin with when they've gotten elected with a bullet vote.
Uh-oh. If you could tell me when we're ready.
We're going.
Okay.
You want to know how cumulative voting would alleviate some of the power that the leadership has, including the power to dispense the campaign money. Well, as we've already pointed out, if you have, especially if you have multi-member districts, each member has to raise a third of the amount of money they would have to raise if they cover the whole district. So you start out with this not as big a challenge, and that person, because of the bullet vote, can have independence from the leadership to begin with. They have to get out and organize and raise money, but I've always felt that raising the money in the level in which we had to raise it was part of campaigning. If people have contributed $5 to you, it's like betting money on a racehorse. They are going to work for you, and because they want you to win. and many of my contributions were $5, $10, $25. $100 in the primary was a big contribution in those days. So I think that gave a lot of independence.
So if we were to reinstate cumulative voting,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what do you think we would need to do? I know I've asked you this with
Fire.
Professor Mikva, but
Now say that again now.
if we wanted to bring back cumulative voting,
Uh-huh.
what would we need to do?
All right, right after this election, you'd have to get out to I'd start with groups, men's groups, good government groups, maybe the Union League Club, chambers of commerce groups, anybody that's having a dinner anywhere, ask for 5 minutes on the agenda just to explain what you're doing and that why you feel accumulated voting is important. Maybe you'll need 10 minutes, but develop a message that can be said in that amount of time. I'd go to business and professional women. That's a very strong group. And if you get time on at one of their meetings, just a little bit on the agenda, see how many signatures their group would pledge to try to get. Because you want to get groups that will go to their membership, like the Illinois Education Association. That's a group that's sure to be for cumulative voting. Just look over the list of groups and pick the ones that you feel will be sympathetic to it. And then start with the groups. And because the more the groups can get all their membership involved, it makes your job easier. Because then you're going to get to individuals, and you want key individuals to have coffees just the way you run a campaign. You know, you've got to have it spread geometrically. And I guess your first decision is which do you want to go for, increasing the membership back, you know, to what it was, or sticking with this membership and dividing it differently. I wouldn't touch the Senate. I wouldn't touch the membership of the Senate. You'll just have to do it like how many signatures do we have to have?
To be safe, you need validly 240,000.
240,000. Well, and you need it all over the state.
You don't.
You don't need it? It doesn't have to be geographically divided? Oh, that's good, because you could get a lot in this 6-county area, I think. I think you're going to find lots of sympathy for this in Republicans living in Chicago and Democrats in DuPage County and Lake County and so on. So you want to go for the minority party in each area to get your big support.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go while we're on this subject, let's hear you did speak with Abner on this thing, so let's have you go on this question of going back to the bigger district. I think you might favor that, having had experience with that, with the bigger legislature. Talk about that question, because that's one of the unresolved key points. Let's hear you on which way this movement should go on that question. Going back to a bigger
right.
house or bigger district.
All right, the question is, what size should the house be? That's a good question. I know when we had a meeting to discuss this, my first choice was keeping the house the same size and subdividing the districts differently. Then, as the discussion proceeded, and the young woman there said, let's go back to the way it was. We know that was good. You know, we know, we have a lot of proof that it was better with the larger thing. So let's go for broke and just call it the Take Back Amendment, take back our house, give it back to the people, because the people were better represented in that size house. And it isn't going to cost that much more money, because you won't be paying for the big staffs. People can get by with a smaller staff. And so you'll have the decisions really made by the people you elect to make them, rather than a staff member who can't be held accountable for a decision. So on balance, I think I would try for the bigger, going back to the size that the house was.
There's one other thing that just came up to me, because you added that staff thing, so we haven't heard that at all. No one else has said that to us yet, that staff question, maybe obvious to you. But there's another question here now. Could you get rid of somebody, get somebody moved out of office more readily because of cumulative voting? Maybe not. These incumbents, or somebody who didn't perform well, or really was out of touch with the district, something like that. Was cumulative voting helpful in getting rid of a bad actor? Or maybe not at all, that people would stay in? I was curious on that point.
You want to know if cumulative voting can help you get rid of an incumbent who is not reflecting your views. I think it'd be very helpful, because it's very difficult to get rid of an incumbent when it's just a one-on-one vote. But if you have that bullet vote and you have 3 people running in a district, I have seen, in fact, in my second term, Lou Morgan, who was the majority leader of the Republican Party and in line to be Speaker, the group, he and I were trying to run as a team, both of us being from the moderate wing of the party. But the very enthusiastic, not to say zealous members of the more conservative branch of the party wanted one of us out. They didn't care which one they got rid of. They probably would have preferred to get rid of me because he had a position of power. But so they all bulleted for the conservative, and it knocked off Lou Morgan, who was the majority leader of the party at the time. So, and if that can happen, you could get rid of any incumbent.
That's a very good point.
That was really, boy, that last time.
That's a great point. I think
Now, when this goes around, you may not want to keep the names in.
No, well, we have, let's go to that
Wait.
roll call, this distinguished, again, Mr. Bickford was not quite as ready to go for that, he was being more politic here.
Yeah.
But I want to hear from you, especially on the Republican side, we've heard from Democrats about excellent Republican legislators.
Yeah.
If you could talk about excellent legislators who came from this, who was no way they were going to be in the Congress if it hadn't been for, in
The cumulative voting.
Right, so that kind of, talk about the roll call or
Okay.
names, actual names.
people that you're very happy that got elected.
Yes, people that really, in my view, were the creative legislators who really came up with original legislation. And sometimes they did it just to make a point of something that should happen, even though they knew it wasn't going to pass. I think Abner McVar would corroborate that. But the key ones that I remember were Harold Katz, Adlai Stevenson, the third was there my first term, Eugenia Chapman, John Matajevich, Aaron Jaffe, Bill Woods Bowman on the Democrat side. Then you got the women. You had Carol Moser Brown was a very creative legislator. She was very strong on education and health and child care, which were the same issues I was working on very hard. Barbara Flynn Curry, Don Clark Natch, who of course was in the Senate. Then on the Republican side, we had Lynn Martin, and we had Virginia Frederick, and Frances Dawson, was an absolutely remarkable woman legislator. She was there my first term. And all of these people, were independent Democrats and Republicans. I mentioned Gene Hoffman, who was a very independent Republican. Art Telsa, Republican from the city of Chicago, and Roy Sandquist. These were outstanding people, and they had the courage. They voted with the party when it was a special issue of a party line issue, but they were creative in their original legislation.
That's great.
Is that
Can't
it?
come up with any more, huh?
I'm
You're
dry.
Okay, so Ash, any final thing
Anything you'd
want
like
to
to
say
say?
that whether we've talked about it or not, if you want to make some kind of, okay, this is it, this is my last thing I want to say.
Take
Okay,
your
say
time.
nothing.
Now, let me think. Well, I think in the final analysis, we look at our legislatures, both at the national level, Congress, and in the state legislature, and we see this absolute partisan approach to government. Not two people, one from each party, trying to come up with the best solution to a problem, but we see it's gamesmanship. How can we beat the other one? Each party views the other one as an enemy. So the question arises, when did this begin to happen? And how can we change it and get back to civility? And from my personal experience and from watching the legislature in session now, speaking at the level of the state legislature, I think the lack of civility began there when we did away with cumulative voting and the multi-member districts. Because now it's just like two armies in full regalia fighting each other. And we've seen this when the Republicans have had a majority. The Speaker had the privilege of not even calling a Democrat's bill if you didn't want it to pass. And we see the same thing happen when the Democrats have the majority. This just total squelching of many good ideas. And the only way to see that the good, creative, positive ideas will have a voice on the floor of the state legislature is to bring back multi-member districts and cumulative voting.
I'm Daniel Pierce, former state representative, now an attorney, and former mayor of Highland Park, but I think relevant to this, it's a former state representative.
Okay, and if when we introduce you, we have a 20-second voiceover for a quick biography. What would that be?
20 years state representative, practicing Chicago attorney.
Okay, great.
Graduate of Harvard Law School. 3 kids, 5 grandchildren.
Born in Berkeley. Why don't we just start on the topic we were talking about? Why did the parties restrict their nominations to 2, and in some cases only to 1?
Well, the parties used a form of mathematics which told them they needed close to 80% of the vote to elect 3 candidates, because a straight vote for the minority party would, if the minority party put up 1, would result in 3 votes, where a straight vote for the majority party, if they put up 3, would only amount for 1 vote apiece. So as a mathematics, they didn't feel comfortable unless they had over 80% vote. Now, there were very few districts in Illinois where that was the case. In the years immediately prior to the elimination of cumulative voting, there were inner city districts in Chicago where the Democrats could elect 3. What they often did was put it in a third party and elect a third, because the third party get more votes than the Republicans. And I think in 1 or 2 cases they might have elected 3 Democrats towards the end. But usually the way they went was they would get a Pouncy Taylor party. Pouncy Taylor was a Democratic rep, and then he would run on the Taylor Pouncy party, and the Democrats would then still put up 2, and the Republicans would put up 1, and the objective was to get the Taylor Pouncy party to run ahead of the Republican, which could be done in inner city minority districts towards the end. But those were exceptions to the rule. You're right, in most cases, in strong Republican areas, the Republicans would put up 2, the Democrats 1, and in strong Democratic areas, the other way around. There was a period, I think, maybe prior to the Roosevelt period in the 30s, prior to 32, when the Republicans did elect some 3-member districts. I think McHenry County was that way at one time. I haven't exactly looked into that. But once Roosevelt was elected in 32 and the Democrats made their big comeback in 30, there were very few districts that were so Republican in the state that the Democrats didn't have, say, 25% of the vote. And it could assure by running 1, they'd elect 1. If the Republicans ran 3, they'd be running against each other, and it led to party disunity. It also led to breakup of straight votes, because each of the candidates would be nervous and want to make sure they were elected if you ran 3, and they would urge people not to vote straight, which was the 1 vote apiece, but to bullet for them, which was 3 votes, or vote for 2 of the 3, which was 1.5 vote apiece. So it broke up straight tickets, it broke up party unity, and those were all reasons not to do it. And in some districts in Chicago, when the Democratic Party was at its strongest in the 30s and 40s, they would control the Republican organization in the district, and they would put up a friendly Republican, although he might vote Republican on organization of the legislature for the speaker, he would vote with the Democrats quite often whenever they needed him after that. In fact, the senior Mayor Daley, Richard J. Daley, I understand filled a vacancy after a Republican death, and they ran him as a Republican the first time. The Democrats did. Had the Republican organization put him on the ballot after the primary to fill the vacancy, because they controlled the Republican committeeman. That was often the case in the Kelly Nash Machine days and Richard J. Daley days, that the Democratic Party of Cook County controlled the Republican Party in certain inner city or certain very strong Democratic districts. They would name the Republican committeeman or have working relationships with them.
Somebody will say that Democrats and Republicans' clothing went on all through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, up until the abolition of cumulative voting.
That was only true, I think, on the west side of Chicago, the so-called West Side Block. There, they tend to work. They tended to work with the Democrats, but they'd take the Republican chairmanships when the Republicans had the majority. They still voted for organization with Republicans. Once in a while, they swing over maybe on a close matter of organization. I think one vote. There might have been times when they did. Basically, that was the only place I think that was true. In most places, the minority member was the only elected official from that party, and he was a kind of a figure in the statewide party because he was the Democratic party in that downstate area, or the Republican Party in certain Republican cities like East St. Louis, or certain Democratic cities like East St. Louis, places like that. So I don't think that was true as much as people thought it was, except in the so-called West Side block of Chicago, which was the area when the West Side was still Caucasian enclave there.
I understand there was some change in which parties had to nominate at least two, even when they were the minority party.
Well, Governor Kerner, after the large election in '64, where the Democrats elected 118 of the 177, there were virtually two Democratic incumbents in every district. That was the Johnson-Goldwater landslide, so the Democrats prevailed, elected all their candidates. So when '66 came up, 2 years later, Governor Kerner, they were still feeling their oats, mandated or directed that the Democratic committeemen put up two in each district, even districts where they could only elect one. And they did in every district except one. In one district in Aurora, which wasn't the most, actually the most Republican of districts, but was slightly Republican then, the Democrats only put up one candidate because the Democratic incumbent was strong enough to talk his committeeman into, representative committeeman, into only nominating one. What they would do, they would certify about the time that the petitions were filed, how many they were to nominate. So in the primary, you know how many were to be nominated. Anyone could run in the primary, but you nominated one or two. Almost never you say three. And that one district, out of the 59 districts in 1966, the Democrats put up one. All the others, they put up two. It turned out to be a big Republican year, 1966, and many of the Democratic incumbents lost out.
Do you know if that rule stood, or was it gone by '68?
That was gone by '68, yeah, because it was a disaster in '66. '66 turned out to be a big Republican year. It followed, I believe, the Martin Luther King marches in the northwest and southwest side of Chicago. There was a big backlash from ethnic Democratic areas all going Republican. And I think nationally, as I recall, '66 was a Republican year too.
I'm sorry, did the Republicans ever have a similar rule?
No, not that I recall. I don't recall the Republicans ever requiring two in each district. The origins, the origins are kind of interesting of why we had cumulative voting to start with in Illinois. And after the Civil War, Illinois was a very divided state. Politically, the southern part of the state was Democratic, believe it or not, and the northern part, north of Springfield, was very, very Republican, and so regionalism prevailed, and also bad feelings from the Civil War. Some were more sympathetic in southern Illinois with slavery in the South than were people in northern Illinois, and so it turned out that whole areas of the state had no Republican representation, and whole areas of the state had no Democratic representation. The city of Chicago itself was Democratic, but most of northern Illinois was staunchly Republican. It was made up either of people who came from New England originally, or German immigrants, Scandinavian immigrants that tend to be Republican and were rural. And the southern part of the state was settled by people who came from Kentucky, following the same course of Lincoln's family. But they were Democrats. They maybe originated in North Carolina, Virginia, moved to Kentucky, Indiana, into southern Illinois. And that was the population of southern Illinois at that time. And the state was quite divided. So the Chicago Tribune and in particular its editor, at the publisher at the time, got the idea when the 1870 Constitution, that was Joseph Medill, got the idea at the time of the 1870 Constitution, which is a little hard for us to remember, but that was only 5 years after the end of the Civil War, to break up this divisiveness in the state, where one party was one place of the state and the other party was the other, and there was no two-party system, devised the cumulative voting as a great reform. And of course, was put in the 1870 Constitution, I guess the only state that had it at that time. They didn't stop there on our corporation law. It provided for cumulative voting. Illinois corporations, in the election of directors, the stockholders had cumulative voting, and they did till recent years, really, to the 1970 Constitution, where they could get rid of it or keep it. So cumulative voting was a noble experiment of the time, achieving minority representation, healing the wounds of the Civil War, the divisiveness of the state politically, and stayed with us, you know, for about 100 years or more.
You were elected under that cumulative voting system.
Well, I was elected first under the large election when the legislature failed to reapportion, as was required by the amendment to the Illinois Constitution, and really by the courts around the country. It hadn't reapportioned since 1903 till 1956, and they hadn't for the next 10 years either. And at that election, they had a special law. No one thought they'd ever have a large election, but they passed a special law where each party could only nominate 2/3 of those to be elected, thus assuring the 1/3 minority representation, kind of like the old cumulative voting did. And the Democrats in that year elected all their 118, and the Republicans elected 59 of their 118 candidates to make up the 177 members House. Now, cumulative voting, we should also remember, only pertained to the House of Representatives, not to the state Senate. So it was really an experiment at House level. It was never adopted for the Senate. It made more sense for the House because you have 3-member districts, where the Senate had single-member districts where you couldn't, of course, have cumulative voting. But the House was big enough to have it. And so then 2 years later, we ran with cumulative voting, and in my district they elected 2 Republicans, and I was the only Democrat. The other incumbent from the large election lost out. He ran 4th in the final election, and I ran 3rd. I did stay in the legislature long enough to run in the first non-cumulative election, the last cumulative vote election, but the first non-cumulative, which, as I recall, was 1982, where I was reelected without cumulative voting in a single-member district. At that time, they then created 2 single-member House districts in each Senate district, because they'd reduced the House from the 177 members to 118, with 59 senators elected from single-member districts, and 2 House districts in each Senate district electing single members. And that's been our system since, starting in 1982, after the constitutional amendment. And I was successful in that election, so I proved I could win without cumulative voting. Pat Quinn said I would, but he was right in my case, but not in a lot of other cases. A lot of other Democrats lost out, and Republicans in the city.
That's good. Tell us a little more about that change of who actually, when the cumulative voting was changed, was gotten rid of, it did make a difference as to what happened, who was in the legislature.
Well, cumulative voting served 2 purposes. There was cumulative voting in the primary as well. That was by legislation, not by the Constitution, which many people forget. Cumulative voting in the primary allowed independents to be nominated, because if the Democrats would put up 2 candidates in the primary, they get 1.5 votes apiece, and if an independent Democrat ran, he could get 3 votes, because people would just bullet for him. The bullet vote in the same way on the Republican side. And that's another reason, which I neglected to say, why the parties didn't nominate 3, because then it made it even easier for an independent to come along. If you had 3 straight party people, and they were voting, there was no straight vote in the primary, but they were instructing their precinct captains to vote for all 3 of their regulars, and the independent then could get 3 votes, and they were getting 1 vote apiece. It was very easy for the independent to run at least 3rd, and then if it was a strong district, be elected in be elected in November with or without the bullet vote, but with the bullet vote still helping him. So that allowed many independents in Chicago to be nominated, independent Democrats. It allowed Republicans, of course, to be nominated. So once that was eliminated, you tended to get less independents, both downstate in the Republican areas and in Chicago in the Democratic areas. We even had independents on the west side, independent black candidates, new candidates coming along and beating the organization on the west side after the black voter became more sophisticated with independent political organizations there. And the IVI on the south side, IPI on the north side, elected the people, Mike Holowinski, Jim Houlihan, others, were elected because in the primary they gave those people 3 votes. The regular organization was giving its 2 candidates 1.5 votes. So what would happen then after that happened, the 2 organization candidates would start to fight with each other and cheat and tell their supporters to give me 3 votes because if you want me in, don't split it 1.5 apiece, and it led to a lot of bad feeling within party organizations. So once cumulative voting was eliminated, it gave more party control in the primary of getting regular organization people. Then in November, we know what it did. It virtually eliminated Republicans from the city of Chicago, which were some of the more effective legislators, Republican legislators. People like Elroy Sandquist and Bernie Epton and people like that. And some of the Democrats downstate and in the suburbs were eliminated after that election too. John Matajevich from North Chicago, other strong Democratic members who happened to live in Republican districts that had a Lake Forest or a Lake Bluff or some community like that in it. So we saw in my opinion, the legislative leaders became more important, the members less important individually. Starting right then in the 82 election, that was the first time that Mike Madigan became Speaker, January 83, following that election. No, George Ryan was still Speaker. Then Madigan came in 2 years. No, Madigan was elected. I'm wrong. Madigan was elected in Speaker in January 83, and the party dominance came to a point that had never existed before. Also, another interesting thing happened. People started donating money to the top, and they were distributing it down to the members because there weren't that many independent type legislators, and the leaders became stronger and stronger, the members and committee chairmen weaker and weaker. So just what the opposite, I think, happened of what League of Women Voters and certain newspapers and others, Union League Club, others that were promoting the unaccumulative voting, thinking they would have more excitement, more one-on-one races. There's probably less of those now than there were prior, and certainly less independence in the legislators. So I think I think the change was for the worst in Illinois, and others may not agree, but that's from my experience. I don't think the individual legislators are of the professional caliber of people successful in their own fields anymore. Abner Mikva was elected with cumulative voting in the Democratic primary in the Hyde Park area. That's how he started out his career. Tony Scariano in the south suburbs. They ran against party organizations in the primary. And the same way with Republicans in the city who went on to successful careers. People like Bernie Epton and so on. They were legislators that could no longer be elected.
What was the cutback campaign like? How did we lose cumulative voting?
It was good against evil. The reformers, almost without exception, including some major newspapers, the Tribune originally opposed it because they were looking back to Joseph Medill, whose great reform it was. But by the time the final thing came, they'd softened on the issue and were very soft on it. But newspapers downstate like Peoria Journal-Star and Decatur Herald, influential newspapers downstate, and I think maybe the Sun-Times, and suburban newspapers, followed the lead of the League of Women Voters that the cumulative voting was an old thing that allowed minority representation, allowed the Republican Party, particularly in the west side of Chicago and in some of the minority areas, to be dominated by the Democrats, which was true in a few districts. And so it became a great cause to restore one-on-one interest in the election. Why were we the only state that had cumulative voting? And they lost out after the constitutional amendment, new Constitution of 1970. There was an option there, 2A and 2B, I think it was, where you could either eliminate cumulative voting or keep it. And keeping cumulative voting barely passed, but it did. So we kept cumulative voting after the 1970 Constitution, but lost it in what was it, 1980, November 1980 election, 10 years later. So the almost all reform groups, Union League Club, I don't know what their interest was, but they adopted it as a big cause. League of Women Voters, who opposed the change were labor unions, Democratic Party in Chicago, Republican Party maybe in a few places. Basically, it was considered a great reform to eliminate cumulative voting. So the reform of 1870 became, in people's minds, the obsolete dinosaur of 1970.
Why do you think that happened?
It happened because of a few districts. It happened because there were instances in Chicago at one time of a certain amount of, you might even call it mob control of the Republican Party in areas where there were very few Republicans, particularly on the west side of Chicago and in both white and black areas on the west side of Chicago. And the way Republicans resented that those so-called traitors or in their party who were aligned with the Democrats and some people thought aligned with the underworld. And they wanted to get rid of that, so that was their whole cause. But meanwhile, that had been getting less and less important as those districts were changing and minority representation was coming in there. The old influence of the underworld was actually receding. About the time they had receded to maybe 2 or 3 districts, by the time they passed it, Percy and Ogilvy pushed this hard in the large election. When they nominated the candidates, they couldn't have a primary, statewide primary. They nominated them in a state convention, and they purged some of these West Side disloyal Republicans and 1 or 2 downstate and didn't nominate them. They were out for 2 years. A lot of them came back in '66. It's primary when they went back to the system of districts and cumulative voting, but they were mostly purged by so-called Percy Purge, which is now long forgotten, in the '64 nomination by convention, a statewide convention of these. Percy was the gubernatorial candidate that year of the state representatives. So it had cumulative voting had a bad taste in reformers' mouth because of maybe 4 or 5 districts, primarily on the west side of Chicago.
So could you describe, or could you compare and contrast serving in the cumulative voting house and the cutback house?
Well, the cutback house, I only served in the first 2 years, but I did notice more and more power going to the leadership, less. The cumulative voted members, those elected in the primary within their own parties, independents, and those elected in the general election, tended to be more independent of statewide party control than the ones who were elected afterwards. They abolished commissions, they abolished legislative commissions, anything where members had their own power flew to the top. Now, we know that goes back and forth. It just hasn't gone back again yet. Maybe when the current leaders who are very strong, Mike Madigan retires as Speaker or Democratic leader, and the Republican leader Lee Daniels retires, maybe the new leaders won't be as strong or won't have the control or have to make so many compromises to be chosen leader that you'll get some power flowing back to the individual members. But that's the main thing I noticed. It also, cumulative voting was a way for people who had other businesses to be elected without real tough contests. The only contest was in their own primary. If majority party put up 2 and the minority party put up 1, and they didn't have to run every 2 years. Under our Illinois House system in our early primaries, those who will be sworn in January '99, those elected this fall, will have to file petitions in December '99 for the next election, have to start circulating petitions in October and November following their swearing in January, less than a year prior to the previous election, and only a year subsequent. So it's a continuous electoral process, partly caused by the fact we have about the earliest primary of any state to nominate congressional, legislative, and state officials. Some states have earlier presidential primaries.